right, let's get down to painting our little teapot here. I just went and I literally Googled tea kettle line drawing and found one, printed it, and traced it using a light box. So if you do not feel comfortable actually drawing something from scratch, that's a great way to do it. Otherwise, draw yourself a little teapot and then join along and figure out how to paint it. We're really focusing on value for this one. So it's gonna be a lot of wet on wet and then leaving some highlights as well. So I'm not using masking fluid. Instead, I'm going to be avoiding certain areas just by being careful with my paint, because paint only goes where water goes. So if I don't put water there, the paint won't go there. So I'm gonna be using an 8 round brush to begin, because I need a lot of water on my brush to first really fill in the main body of my tea kettle. Now, you can't quite see what I'm doing because it's just water. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a wash. I'm moving water around my paper, avoiding the areas that I've decided I want to keep as highlights, which you'll see in a moment. It's one rectangle area up in the top left, and then a rounder, skinnier oval area that will be down in the right, acting like the reflection of light that's coming from somewhere else in the space that the tea kettle is hanging out. When you're creating a wash, the biggest thing you're paying attention to is that you keep the water where you want it, because wherever you put the water, that's where the paint will go. So I'm being careful to make sure that the water stays inside my lines as best I can. I will outline with pen when I'm done, because I like to do that, and because it makes me able to clean up any edges I might have accidentally painted outside of. All right, I really am going for an even shininess, not puddles, but also nothing dry. So depending on how thirsty your paper is, it might soak up a lot of the water, and this might take a few layers, or the water might sit right on top. So if you can see, look how it's evenly shiny, not any puddles. And you can also see those areas that are not wet. Okay, I'm gonna drip in my color paint. I'm gonna be using pretty much just one color because this is a fairly monochrome thing. I'm gonna choose some of this ultramarine, I believe, blue, but I always have a dirty palette, so I'm just gonna make it use whatever's in this corner, because I also like when colors are not perfectly normal, because it just makes them more interesting. I'm gonna do a very light, oh, this is not super light. I'm gonna only use the paint I just grabbed, and I'm gonna put that everywhere inside my wet area. So I'm gonna really spread this out and try to water it down, because I want this coat to be the lightest layer of paint. In watercolor, we have to go from light to dark. So I'm starting with something very light, and I'm gonna slowly layer up the colors on top of it. Most of this teapot I'll be doing with wet on wet techniques, which means while it's wet, I'm gonna be painting the next step with wet paint. So now that I have my base layer of blue, I'm gonna go ahead and add some more blue, and I'm gonna draw in some stripes of shadow. Now, the reason I'm making them like stripes is because my teapot has this metal edge to it, and the metal is always kind of shiny in stripes. So I'm dripping in these stripes. If they bloom, I'm taking a dry brush and I'm pulling that bloom back out to make sure it spreads evenly. And again, I'm thinking about these stripes. So I'm trying to get more paint on my brush so it's kind of milky, not super watery. The more watery it is, the more you're gonna have those kind of blooms happen, even if you don't want them to. I'm also gonna make this shadow go along the bottom of my tea kettle, because that's of course where there'd be a shadow at the base. All right, and I'm gonna go ahead and draw a few more kind of stripes of shadow. I'm avoiding this top area because this should be more of a highlight, so my stripes don't go all the way up to the top. They kind of stop at this top area. In fact, I'm gonna clean off my brush, and with a dry brush, I'm gonna try to lift a little bit of my paint out. I really have to lay my brush on the side to do this. Look how it's kind of lifting. Look how it's kind of lifting out that area. Now this area looks lighter than the rest. I'm gonna go again with my dry brush and just kind of tweak some of these stripes. I'm looking for those weird blooms where they made kind of a circle when I really want it to look like stripes. And I think that pretty much does it. Maybe I'll add actually a little bit more of a shadow in the corner using a tiny bit of black, but mixing it with my blue to make sure it's more of a dark blue. I'm just gonna drip in a nice, really dark shadow. Contrast is important in any type of art. Well, I suppose not any type of art, but it's valuable with what we're learning and what we're doing. So I'm gonna make sure I have some nice dark areas with my light. Okay, now you could use a heat gun, which I have handy, but I'm also just going to jump around and paint somewhere that's not touching the same area, because then I don't have to wait for this to dry. It will dry as I paint the next area. So I'm gonna paint the lid of my tea kettle next. Once again, I'm gonna start with a very light, that is not very light, this is very light wash. Now this time you'll notice I did the wash with the paint. That's because it's such a small area and I'm not working around any highlights. I wasn't really worried about it drying too quickly. Normally you create a wash with plain water because then if it dries, it doesn't create a hard edge. If you use ink when you're creating your wash and it dries, you're gonna end up with a hard edge that's possible to get rid of, just not fun to get rid of. Now that I've created the wash, I made this bottom edge of my lid a little darker to create a shadow. And I'm going to use a smaller brush and create some shadows that come down. Not really shadows, these are more like reflections. They're just dark reflections. They come and they follow the shape of the lid. Sometimes I'm even gonna do kind of two side by side. So it's kind of this mirror glass looking thing where there's some of the dark and then it curves with the direction of the lid. I really don't want them to look like decoration stripes. I want them to look like light stripes, which means they shouldn't be all the same and there should be kind of sometimes a space in between them. I have a white gel pen I like to use at the end, so we'll see. I might use that today to really create some nice highlights in there if I need to. I'm gonna jump up and do my handle up here now, still waiting for that body of my teapot to dry. So I'm gonna once again start by doing a wash of the area. It's fairly small, so I could have done the same thing as I did with my lid, where I actually have paint with the first wash, so it's also easier for you to see that way. Here is my light wash of color. And then I'm going to create the shadow at the bottom. Now, when I'm trying to paint very carefully in one spot, I like to make sure the tip of my brush is touching the edge that I'm painting on. So I turned my paper to make sure that the edge of my brush was touching and drawing on the edge of that shape. It's a lot harder if I was to try to do it this way to know where my brush is touching, because I'd be using the back of it as the edge. Now I'm drying my brush off and I'm just going to fade that edge away, making sure it's clean so I don't want the paint to actually get darker all the way to the top. I just want it to fade the edge. There, so now I have this kind of medium tone with a shadow at the bottom. There's also a little bit of a lever or a button up here for how you open the kettle. So I'm just gonna make sure that gets painted in. I did paint outside the lines a little bit up here, so we'll see if my pen fixes it at the end. I'm not too worried about it. Okay, this is feeling mostly dry. If it wasn't, I could go get my heat gun, but I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the spout of my tea kettle. This time, I'm going to start with my wash, but I'm actually going to leave a stripe of white in the center of my tea kettle spout. This will act as another highlight. I'm gonna close the highlight when it comes to the end, and at the top it doesn't need to go all the way there either. I'm trying to make the highlight go narrow to wide, just like the spout shape itself, to make a nice bright highlight on the side. I might actually, I think, break it in half a little bit. I think that looks kind of cool. If you've never noticed like window reflections, sometimes they have a break in the middle. Not necessary, kind of cool. I'm gonna add my shadow while it's still wet. So I'm gonna get a darker blue color, and once again, I'm aiming my brush at the edge that I want the shadow on to make sure I can really draw nice and neatly. And I'm trying to make the shadow wider at the bottom, skinnier at the top. to make it look more realistic with the curve of the spout. And then I'll even extend that shadow up a little bit to have a shadow at the edge where it touches the teapot. Okay, I'm gonna go and do the center area here. This is pretty simple. I'm gonna make it a nice light, much lighter than what I just did, area of blue. Hopefully the areas above and below it are dry. If not, I will have a hard time. It's looking like they're dry, so be careful. And I'm actually gonna make a shadow at the top of this area because this lid is sitting on it. So the lid would be what's casting a shadow. I'm just gonna mix up some more dirty blue color to match what I've got going. And I'm gonna draw my shadow right underneath the lid. There. And maybe a little bit of a line down here. I'm missing some contrast between this part and the body. So I did kind of a shadow at the top and bottom of that section. But depending on how yours looks, you might only need a shadow at the top where the lid is resting down. Okay, for the little knob at the top, I want it to be light, medium, dark when it comes to values. The top should be the lightest because it's facing the ceiling. The middle should be medium because it's the side of it, and the bottom is being almost covered up. There's an overhang, so it should be much darker, almost as dark as my darkest shadows down here. I'm gonna go ahead and start with my medium tone because then I can make the top lighter and the bottom darker and know it's going to look nice. So there's my medium tone. I'm gonna water down my brush a little bit and spread the lighter tone into the top. And then I'm gonna pick up some more paint and put the shadow down at the bottom. I'm painting these all at the same time, knowing that they could bleed into each other, and I'm okay with that. Thinking it could look nice and watercolory if they've got a little bit of variety in them. Okay, got my nice shadow at the base of that handle. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and do these wires, and I'm just gonna make them a very, very light. No wash really needed. I'm just gonna paint very carefully inside of those lines to get that kind of metal. I'm thinking of like a silvery metal color for these handle type. Not quite the handle, it's more like the metal structure of the handle. And very neatly following it. You might be noticing I'm using a bent brush right now. I enjoy this because I can flip it and I can pull in different directions. Pulling your brush is always the best way to have control over it. And normally if I was using a regular brush and I was pulling one way, I would have to completely turn my paper to pull the other way because pulling this way with my hand is not as natural. And so by having an angled brush, I have just a little bit more freedom to pull in different directions without actually turning my whole paper around. So kind of fun. Okay, I think my painting is pretty much done. I'm gonna make sure it's really dry and then do my pen outline on top. All right, I'll be using my Micron. It is a PN size, which pretty much just stands for pen. It's got a nice pen tip that's easy to use, hard to break. And I'm just gonna go ahead and outline kind of like loosely, I'm not really super worried. I'm just trying to create the kind of final outline and contrast. All right, the last few things I did, I also added some more white outlines just to get more details, more little highlight squares and things. So here is the final result, working with different values, lights and darks, trying to keep some of those bright highlights, and working with 3D and playing with color, working on those stripes to make it look more metallic and have that reflection. So I hope that was helpful for you. I hope you give it a try. Take a look at my other tutorials to see some other things, as well as online courses that teach you even more techniques and really push you beyond basic step-by-step tutorials. So check out that in the description below, and I'll see you next time.